Nice to see you all, and I'm really delighted to have been invited to chair this particular session this afternoon, which will focus on inclusive physical education. So we've come back to physical education, and I am joined by three wonderful colleagues who are much more knowledgeable and embedded in the area of inclusive physical education than I am. So I will hand over to them to ask them to just give a brief introduction. And then we're going to run the session very much like Stuart ran the initial session this morning. There's a bit of question and answer, so relatively informal, but we do have some structure, and I'm going to try to keep the time in. So I'll do my best there. Anyway, without any further ado, can I just hand over to Victoria first to introduce herself?
Sure, thanks Lorraine, and good afternoon everyone. My name's Vicky Wells. I am the Assistant Director for Children and Young People at the Youth Sport Trust, which obviously has its home at Loughborough. I'm a Loughborough alumni, and hopefully we'll be able to bring some of the insights from being on the ground. I specialise in special educational needs and disabilities and lead all of our inclusion work at the organisation.
Can I just interject? Because Vicky has been extremely modest. Vicky has recently been awarded an OBE. For her services and work in with children and particularly in special education needs and disabilities. So huge congratulations, Vicky, and I think your award is excellent.
Everyone, my name is Ollie Hooper. I'll start with the beginning of my Loughborough journey. I came here as a fresh-faced undergraduate student in 2011. The first ever lecture theatre I walked into, Di Bass was stood at the front of it, introduced me to this weird concept called pedagogy that I now myself lecture in. I stuck around, I did my PhD with Lorraine and Joe Harris, and then hung around long enough still that I eventually got a lecturing post, and I'm now here a senior lecturer in physical education and youth sport, a lot of my work being with more marginalised young people.
Hi everybody, my name's Hayley Fitzgerald. I'm currently a Professor of Disability Sport at Leeds Beckett University. And what I should say about that is clearly I'm not trusted to come out of Leeds Beckett to talk because my Dean of Research today, Professor Sue Backhouse, is here. So I feel like I'm under a little bit of surveillance today. So I'm an alumni of Loughborough University. I did an MSc in recreation management with the great Professor not Sue Backhouse, that's you. An MSc in recreation management with Sue Gliptus, and I also then worked here for 6 years as a researcher, and whilst I was being a researcher, I did a PhD as well. And again, not to be trusted because Professor David Kirk is here who supervised my PhD. Thank you, David.
Thank you, wonderful. Okay, on to inclusion in physical education, really where we're going to try to critically discuss past, present and future from both a policy, practice and research perspective, all in that time. So let's get going. First question then. Can you briefly share a defining experience in your work, whether that be research, academic or practical, that highlights the uniqueness of physical education as a subject, and which you think we need to be particularly cognizant of with regards to inclusion and inclusive practice?
Do you want me to go first because I've got a baton? Yeah. It's interesting because when Lorraine suggested that this might be a question, I thought I need to go back 25 years to talk about a defining experience for me, which I thought, gosh, that's a long time. But having listened to Stuart's presentation this morning, I just realised that's relatively recent history, isn't it? Anyway, my defining experience has to be when I worked in disability sport. And part of the role I had was to go into mainstream schools and to begin to support physical education teachers to help them think through how they could include young disabled people in physical education. The reality of that experience was quite often I was essentially just given a group of 3, 4 or 5 young disabled people and told to go over there and teach those students. That was interesting because I wasn't actually a qualified physical education teacher. I think the other interesting point about that experience was the fact that the young disabled people had no choice about working with me. So they couldn't be with their peers in the mainstream part of the lesson. And the other thing that really struck me was the way in which the physical education teachers at the time were at a real loss to understand how to effectively include young disabled people in physical education. And I suppose because of that experience, when I did come to work at Loughborough University, and made it my mission to begin to engage with young disabled people and to find out more about what they thought about their experiences of physical education and to amplify their voices. And I'm very proud of that beginning stage of my research career.
I think I didn't have to go as far back as 25 years on that one, but I did think back to sort of my first postdoctoral experience after I just finished my PhD, and I had the privilege of working on a project with Rachel Sanford, who's in the room, and a colleague, Tom Cornby at Leeds Beckett, looking at care experience young people and their experiences of physical education. And I thought I was quite inclusive as a researcher, but that really showed me that there are a lot of voices in that space who maybe aren't heard as much. And there are challenges that are faced that you might not be aware of. These young people got taken out of PE because it's not that important, is it, to have official meetings with social workers. They couldn't stay for after school clubs because they had to go home in a taxi. And that was a real turning point in my career that I think has shifted the trajectory of my research towards those marginalised young people and making sure, as we'll talk about a little bit later, I think that their voices are heard and that everybody can benefit from. PE is a really powerful space.
Thanks, Ollie. A bit like Hayley, I suppose a lot of my work has been grounded in working with young people with special educational needs and disabilities. But probably more recently, past sort of, I'd say 5-6 years, I started to be quite curious at the Youth Sport Trust around a range of educational settings that young people found themselves in, sometimes by choice, sometimes not, and how PE was taught in those settings. So I set about a bit of a tour of the UK to go and visit alternative provision settings. So when I talk alternative provision, I mean schools like pupil referral units, social, emotional, mental health, hospital schools, behavioural units. And I think for me that was definitely a defining moment to just see, yes, the creativity and innovation that often can happen in those settings, but also how unique our subject is and how dependent it is on the space, the environment, and how physically safe children and young people feel in their bodies. And my tour took me on some really quite startling sites. So I always still talk about the pupil referral units down in Cornwall. It's probably a third of the size of the room that we are in today. That's their school. PE looked like playing with a sponge ball in the car park. The reason it was the car park, that was the only space they had to be able to play or move. The reason it was a sponge ball, that's where the staff parked their cars. I remember them visiting with a head teacher a site in Birmingham, not too far from where I live now, and it was an old TB hospital. 3 mainstream schools had declined that building because they said it wasn't fit for purpose. When it came down to the pupil referral unit, they had no choice to accept it. So it still baffles me that we are in a state at the moment where we have often our most vulnerable, I would suggest, children and young people in our schools in spaces and environments like that, and then what that looks like when then you come to try and teach physical education if you've got somebody that's got that confidence or competence to be able to do that with young people. And I say that's been my defining moment because I'm relentless at the moment, banging on the door and the drum to make sure that we do better for those children and young people that are in those settings.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really quite outstanding, some of those stories, isn't it? And to know that we're still facing these challenges. And I think that does lead us nicely on to my next question. And I think you've alluded to some already, but, you know, have there been particular challenges and barriers, do you think, historically with regards to inclusive physical education, and perhaps with particular groups like those that you just mentioned there, Vicky?
Yeah, thanks, Lorraine. I'll kick off if that's okay. Again, I'm going to take the lens of disability and young disabled people to think through the beginning part of the answer to this question. And I think what's really important to remember is it was only through the 1981 Education Act that young disabled people had a right to be educated in the mainstream. So the thing we need to remember there is that physical education has existed for much, much longer than young disabled people have occupied mainstream schools. And also, if we remember that physical education was created for and by non-disabled people. So that little potted history that I give you there perhaps then helps us to begin to make sense of perhaps some of the tensions and challenges that have existed and continue to exist in relation to trying to include young disabled people in physical education. So the legacy of the past very much is still influencing how our teachers in schools today are having to grapple with thinking through inclusion of different kinds of groups, but in particular young disabled people.
I think I'd agree with that, that PE wasn't designed with inclusion in mind, and some of that heritage, that history still sticks with the subject today. We still see those gendered curricula in many ways. We still see that dominance of team games in PE lessons. So we're trying still to unpick some of that history and make it more inclusive for more young people, I think.
No, thank you. We were asked to give just a nod to the past, so I think that is a good nod, but a really powerful nod to the past. So if we can move more to the present now, and hopefully it will become a little bit more upbeat as we go forward and a bit more optimistic. But yes, in terms of sort of the present then, and Vicky, this might be a question for you here. What progress would you say has been made regarding inclusive physical education in recent years? In terms, and if you can maybe focus on policy and practice, which I know you're very, very embedded in your work at the YST.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lorraine. And definitely bringing that spirit of optimism here. So what I would say is there's been significant progress in policy and then ripping that through into practice when we talk about inclusive physical education, play, school sport, physical activity. I've had the real privilege of leading our SEND work at the Youth Sport Trust for over 17 years now, and in different guises, a Department for Education, SEND inclusion, in PE grant, and what I've seen over each cycle is an increased emphasis and awareness of inclusion, but also a real moment, and I think we're in that at the moment, a listening piece. There is definitely a lot more listening happening with the sector and engagement with the sector. We are not there yet. I'm not painting a completely rosy picture, but I have seen some significant improvement, and the best way to bring that to life for you, I suppose, this afternoon is where we have been able to deliver on behalf of Department for Education their SEND work. We have done that through a network of what we call at Youth Sport Trust our lead inclusion schools. So they are schools across England, one in every county, that are recognised for their expertise in inclusive physical education and school sport. And there's probably three magic ingredients that I would say really bring to life what happens at policy and how that comes through to practice. So the first one is it takes that national vision, so what it is that we are all fully committed to ensure that every child gets access to inspiring and meaningful provision when it comes to PE, but making sure that works locally. So we meet young people and practitioners and schools where they're at. The second one is it connects and collaborates with experts in the sector and helping to bring that down right down to granular level and supporting the generalist practitioner or physical education teachers or those working with young people. And then the third for me, this is one that I just see where the magic happens, and I'm really fortunate to be able to see this very frequently in my role, where school-to-school support, where schools collaborate locally to say, actually, how are you adjusting your PE lessons? How are you adapting? How can I come and have a look? Can you role model that for me? And if you'll indulge me, I think the best example to bring that to life for you is the awful incident that unfolded in 2017 in Manchester with the Ariana Grande bombing, and unfortunately lots of young people experienced life-changing injuries as a result of that accident. And those young people went through rehabilitation, went through the hospitals, etc., and then they came back and returned to their education, and suddenly mainstream PE teachers were suddenly faced with children, young people that presented with needs that they hadn't had before. The first school that they phoned was their lead inclusion school to say, come and help me adapt my physical education. So actually what I have seen is real improvement at a policy, but actually ensuring that on the ground schools are driving it and are also feeding up what works, but also what doesn't work. And I think that's been a real powerful moment in time that we are seeing that progress. But as I say, it's not perfect yet. I think there's a lot to do. There's a lot of talk around SEND reform at the moment and new curriculum assessment review, enrichment, PE and school sport networks. But again, how that is resourced, the support that's there. But I genuinely feel we're in a place where I see now policy documents that come out that doesn't have a special school as kind of like a token gesture or only focusing on mainstream practice. You see alternative provision, you see special schools as really great examples of practice that are now featuring in policy documents, and that can be only a positive thing.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, I think similar question really, but this time focused on research. So what progress effectively has been made, would you say, with regards to inclusion in physical education in research? What's the evidence telling us?
I think it's a positive picture there as well, in the sense that we've seen a real growth and diversification in that research, in that physical education space. In the early days, we were just looking at girls' experiences, or maybe then on to young people with SEND, but we're looking at a whole host of young people and how they might experience the subject, or what their needs might be, and how we can better configure it to support them. We've seen a real shift towards young people's voices. I think there was an adult-centric agenda at times in the past, but now we're really focusing on giving young people that chance to have a say on their experiences, how they engage in PE and what can be done to make it better for them. And through that, we're seeing a range of these different participatory research approaches that maybe better facilitate those voices. And as well, we're seeing a lot more of those socially informed, more critical perspectives coming through, where we can recognise, social justice and the importance of that, intersectionality, and that, someone doesn't just have gender, they have race, they have ability, and so on. So there's been a real growth of research in that space that just helps us to be better informed as to how we can make sure that more young people can access those developmental benefits of PE. And in terms of what I guess the evidence is telling us, to make sure it's not all doom and gloom, lots of young people do have really positive experiences of PE. They reap these developmental benefits that they might not get in other subjects by merit of it being an embodied subject, the interactions that take place in that space. What we do know is there are still some young people that don't have those positive experiences, that don't get those benefits. So there's still some work to be done, I think, in that space.
Yeah, thanks.
So just picking up on something Ollie said there about participatory research, I think the key for me there, particularly when you're thinking of young people with disabilities, is it actually has enabled now young disabled people to be part of research. Certainly when I began to do research here at Loughborough, the norm was to approach research from a very traditional way, which would in itself exclude young disabled people. So by promoting participatory approaches, what that is actually doing is opening the door for lots of different kinds of young people, and young people with different kinds of impairments in particular, to be part of research. And I think that's been a really significant change over the last 20 years, most certainly.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I know that both of you are doing some really, really excellent work in that space, which is going to be really important moving forward. So thank you. So we've looked a bit at policy practice. Back to practice, really, in that I'm aware that you're practitioners as well in physical education. What would you say then are the ingredients, the prerequisites, if you like, of a really inclusive physical education environment?
I think I'm answering that one, aren't I? Yeah, I've got the easy one to answer. I think there are a number of ingredients here. The first most definitely has to be passionate practitioners. We need practitioners that are empathetic and that care about the young people that they're working with. We also need practitioners who have pedagogical curiosity, that want to explore, that want to have a go, that want to try, that might not get things right, but keep going and keep having a go. And we also need practitioners who will challenge colleagues where there is discrimination and where there is inequality in practice and exclusion. And I should say on that final point, that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, and it's particularly not an easy thing to do for perhaps newly qualified teachers. Some of you, when I've said what a passionate practitioner is, you'll say, yeah, well, we probably, Hayley, all PE teachers and sport coaches should have those different kinds of features. I would suggest that's not necessarily always the case. So passionate practitioners are key. The second sort of ingredient that I would highlight is around young people feeling like they belong. And here I draw on the framework developed actually within the Centre for Social Justice in Sport and Society at Leeds, Beckett. And here we talk about people, and it's very applicable to young people in schools, feeling like they're seen, feeling like they are heard, feeling like they're valued and of feeling like they're known. Those qualities will enable young people to want to come back to the physical education experience and to keep engaging in more physical education. CPD is also another important ingredient, and here I'm reminded of a good friend of mine, Pam Stevenson, who's created, as a practitioner, lots of resources of CPD nationally around inclusion and ensuring young people in schools are included. And she always says to me, come on, Hayley, you know, we don't need academics procrastinating about what inclusion is. We don't need the theorising. We need solutions on the ground. And I do agree with her. And I think tools like the inclusion spectrum and STEP, which I know many of you will be familiar with, are really useful starting points for teachers to begin to work in a more inclusive way. And as Vicky alluded to earlier, we need practitioners to get together and to talk and to share and to learn from each other. And again, in saying that in schools, I think we have to recognise that working in schools is a really challenging space to be at the moment. So actually having that time and having the resource can be problematic in some contexts as well. The final ingredient, which is a really important ingredient, is that physical education departments and schools have inclusion at the beating heart of everything they do, because it's all well and good having a great individual practitioner that's an ally and an advocate of inclusion, but when they leave, there's a void there. So we need embeddedness within school strategy and policy around inclusion. So they would be my 4 key kinds of ingredients, really, in terms of how an inclusive environment could be created.
No, that's really helpful. Would either Ollie or Vicky like to come in there? No, you're happy? I think, yes. Obviously you did a perfect job on that. Exhausted that one. No, thank you. You refer to the importance of practitioners, and this does lead nicely onto another question that I'd like to touch on is, you know, thinking about our future workforce, who are our current students, undergraduates, postgraduates. Where does inclusion then fit into the taught curriculum for students at your institutions? And I guess this is targeted at Ollie and Hayley. Perhaps Ollie, do you want to kick off on this one?
No pressure of the colleagues in the room.
Adequately, and could we?
Okay, yeah.
Are we preparing them? Could we do any better?
Yeah, and I think there's been a real focus on inclusion in our curriculum here at Loughborough, and that's been really accelerated in more recent years with the development of our new sports science, coaching and physical education, or SCAPE as we call it affectionately, programme. Through that, we really try and support our students to have those practical experiences, just like Ron and Rex highlighted from the early days. So we make sure the students get that experience on the ground. They cover topics like alternative activities so we can diversify the curricula they deliver when they're in schools. And we also build in those opportunities for critical reflection on their practice and others, so that they go out as those socially aware practitioners that can question their own practice. Social justice is embedded in all of the work we do. Our teaching is research informed, and the students really do get some cutting edge work around things like trauma informed pedagogies as part of what they do with us. So I think we're doing a good job, if that's okay to say, in sort of exposing those students to inclusive principles, making sure they become aware of diversity and inclusion, and helping them appreciate the importance of being a critical and reflective practitioner when they go on and leave us, to set that positive example of Loughborough that has become synonymous with physical education, I think. I think the challenge we face in that space is that a lot of the students we have come to us, PE worked for them. There's a reason they've chosen to study sports science or physical education at university. And so there's almost a little bit of unlearning or relearning about what PE is or could be to do. And that's always the challenge, that we have to help them see that whilst PE was a really positive space for them, it isn't for all young people. And they sometimes have to see how it might be from someone else's perspective.
I'm just going to take a slightly broader perspective here, Lorraine, if I'm thinking about higher education institutions. And I think Ollie's mentioned some great work that's going on, and there are similarities at Leeds Beckett as well, which is really good to hear. I think one of the things that higher education institutions can do better, particularly physical education teams, is to be more declared about what inclusion is and inclusive practice is. So what I mean by that is for colleagues to get together and actually have very explicit conversations about what they're thinking these things are. So with some colleagues at the University of Worcester, we engaged in an exercise where we talked about what inclusion is and identified 5 principles. And the point of doing that then is that inclusion becomes much more explicit and transparent. So then individually you can check yourself in terms of those inclusive principles, but equally you can think through the curriculum in relation to those inclusive principles as well. So I would say across the UK, PE departments in universities need to be much more declared about what they understand and think inclusion to be.
Thank you. Okay, we've got about 3 minutes, I think, and we're now going to cover the whole future. So, so really briefly then, where are we going next, would you say, with regards to future plan developments? And I'm aware there is lots going on in this space, so perhaps, Vicky, you're well placed here to start us off on this one.
Yeah, thank you, Lorraine. I'll keep it hopefully very headline. So there is a lot happening within the PE school sports space at the moment, whether that is conversations around inclusive enrichment frameworks, a new PE and school sport network to be able to deliver and drive policy, taking that into schools, whether that's the curriculum assessment review, really exploring our subject. So there is a lot happening in terms of how at a policy level that's taking place, but also then how we help schools make sense of all that. And what I hope in terms of some of the things that we talked about in preparation for this is kind of what's your hope for the future and what does that look like? For me, it's hopeful. There's 2 things, if you'll indulge me. One is that we're not talking about inclusive PE because it just is by design. We have hopefully got very confident, very competent practitioners that just recognise and deliver things that are inspiring for young people, so things that they want to take part in. It's accessible, so if they want to take part in it, they can, and it's meaningful, so it really means something to that individual. We call that our I Am framework at the Youth Sport Trust. And then secondly, and I did say I bang the drum relentlessly around alternative provision, but it still baffles me that we're in 2026 and anyone can go and set up a pupil referral unit or alternative provision school, and there is no legislation that states that there has to be any space to play or move. And there is for mainstream, so I am championing to make sure that does get changed, hopefully in the very near future.
Thank you.
And Vicky does a very good job of championing that. And I guess if we're thinking about sort of hopes for the future, I think mine would be that no young person feels that PE isn't for them, that everyone feels PE is a space they can belong, achieve, and reap those developmental benefits that we always preach about, I think, sometimes for PE. And in particular, I'd hope that those young people whose lives are already complex, so for example, care experience young people, don't see PE as another space that excludes them, but as one where they belong, can build relationships and feel safe, that there's possibility there for them. And I do, to try and finish on a positive note, truly believe that if we get the conditions right, physical education can be such a powerful force for good. We just need to make sure we're inclusive of all young people in that space.
Thank you then. Final word from Hayley.
Sorry, and it might not be positive either. No, I know, sorry, we should have done. All I was going to say is, I'm reflecting back on the research that my journey, when I started at Loughborough, I really don't want to hear from young people when they're talking to me about their physical education experiences, some of the horror stories that I have heard over the years. And like Ollie and Vicky, I'm hopeful, but I've also got my fingers crossed a little bit to see if there is real change.
Yeah. Policy rhetoric absolutely playing out in practice is, I think, the message there. Mindful of time. Thank you so much. Can I just take the opportunity to thank Hayley, Ollie and Vicky for sharing your experiences, your insights, your knowledge with us this afternoon.